character. Having the character of the Lord. In the Bible, we are only given just a few brief glimpses into the life of Jonathan, Saul's son. Just a few brief glimpses before his introduction to David. There's only 7 mentions of him before the introduction of David onto the scene. But in spite of the brevity of these appearances or glimpses that we get into his life, the impact of his actions, we know, are very, very consequential, far-reaching, and have a profound effect on those around him. And the honor and integrity that he exhibited through these glimpses that we get of him are not just commendable, but in a lot of ways are kind of awe-inspiring, very challenging. So I want to look at these 7 glimpses today that we get of Jonathan and study it for the express purpose of finding these character-building lessons that his life contains and allow ourselves to be exhorted by this, his great example. Some background context before we actually see him. We know that Saul, his father, was anointed king. And then he immediately raised an army of 330,000 troops. And Saul personally led a successful campaign and defeated the Ammonites. Just in the previous chapters here, he was anointed king and led that amazingly successful campaign against the Ammonites. But we know as the story unfolds that a lot of his early meekness, being small in his own sight, was probably more rooted in his own insecurity than in godly humility, because when the test came, he failed. So now, 2 years later, after his being anointed as king, we find Israel now skirmishing, not at all-out war, but skirmishing with the Philistines. And this is our first glimpse of Jonathan, his son. And we find that he is a ranking commander of sorts in the Israeli army. Let's go to 1 Samuel 13, 1 and 2. Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, Saul chose him 3,000 men of Israel, whereof 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash and in Mount Bethel, and 1,000, that's 1/3 of his army, were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. And the rest of the people he sent every man to his tent. So this is just some basic facts about the man. We know that he's already a grown man at this time. He's captaining 1/3 of the Israeli army, and to be counted a man and to be in the army, you have to be at least 20 years old and up. And people guesstimate that he could have been up to even 40, but probably somewhere in between there. But at the very least, he had to be 20 years old. And when it says that Saul sent the people, every man to his tent, that means that after this Ammonite victory, when he had some momentum, what was his next action? He sent 320,000 of them home. It's keeping only a skeletal standing army of 3,000. Saul was appointed king to overthrow the oppression of the Jewish people, the biggest threat being the Philistines, the ones who were occupying at that time. And so since his victory over the Ammonites, he has done nothing else in these 2 years. And the only thing that you can deduce from this fact is that he's lost his initial zeal since his victory at Jabesh Gilead. And Saul evidently did not want to rock the boat. The status quo was just satisfactory to him, and so he essentially was dallying around. Well, that's Saul. Let's see what Jonathan does. Jonathan's actions are different. Here's our second glimpse of Jonathan. We find out that he's not just a warrior in rank, but in deed. Okay, verse 3 and 4. And Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines that was in Geba, and the Philistines heard of it. So he's had enough of his father's dallying. He's demonstrating our first character quality here of initiative. He's taking the initiative. You know, they had a lot of enemies on all sides of them, but he's tackling the main one. There's a quote by Martin Luther that Dad uses a lot. It says, "If I profess with the loudest voice and clearest exposition every portion of the truth of God except precisely that little point at which the world and the devil are at that moment attacking, not going after that main enemy, I am not confessing Christ, however boldly I may be professing Christ. Where the battle rages, there the loyalty of the soldier is proved, and to be steady on all the battlefield, besides, is mere flight and disgrace if he flinches at that one point." Well, that is a perfect application. Saul has sinned. He had some momentum. He could have attacked them 2 years earlier. But he let it go on, and it took the initiative of his son to bring about some change. Excuse me. And Saul was not going to that point of attack. The circumstances surrounding this particular attack and the times that they were in would have had to necessitate that Jonathan's attack would have had to have been a very fast surprise rush on the garrison. And the Jewish translation provides a little bit more information that we do not always get in the English, is indicate that Jonathan assassinated the Philistine governor that was occupying Geba. And the implication is that he personally did it. So the second victory in Saul's reign was due to Jonathan and his 1,000 men. Let's go on to verse 4. Just read the rest of verse 3 there. "And Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, 'Let the Hebrews hear.' And all Israel heard, saying that Saul had smitten the garrison of the Philistines, that Israel was also had an abomination of the Philistines." Well, he heard say that Saul, really? I read Jonathan just the first verse before. This is seeing shades of what we know his character is going to become fully revealed later on. You know, he'll have the same reaction to the songs of the women. You know, Saul sang his thousands, David his 10,000s, and he eyed David from that moment on. It's the same emotion, only it's directed at his own son now. So, and all the people were called together after Saul to Gilgal. So naturally, Jonathan's victory went over just teaching in Philistia. And they were reciprocated by rallying and gathering together in Michmash. And so Saul is now forced to muster his army all over again. He had them, but he sent them on. So he's forced to muster them again. But only a few are coming. This momentum that he had is now evaporated. And the few that come, many of those who do come, they desert by going and hiding in holes, and some even defect and go side with the Philistines. And Saul's general lack of preparedness for the results of Jonathan's initiative in Geba is one of the reasons why it is assumed that Jonathan acted not contrary necessarily, but independently of his father Saul. So there's the second glimpse. And we're going to jump past where Saul offered the sacrifices illicitly. We know that story. And we're going to see the third glimpse of Jonathan. Jump to verse 16. Here we find the positioning that God is giving him. We have some basic facts about him. He's a warrior, he has rank. He's warrior in rank indeed. And now we learn about his positioning in verse 16. And Saul and Jonathan his son and the people that were present with him abode in Gibeah of Benjamin, but the Philistines were encamped at Michmash. And that may seem like just a lot of general information, but there's a little bit more to it. He's being positioned with God's people in Saul at Gibeah, which consequently is in full view of the enemy's camp at Michmash. There is only a canyon in between them. They can see each other. They can see the enemy just over there. The reason they have been moved is in obvious anticipation of some sort of assault. But Saul, we know from the rest of this chapter, Saul doesn't move. But the enemy is moving. They're sending out 3 companies of spoilers in all directions, roaming about the land, and you can add seeking whom they may devour. Roaming about the land. The enemy is being active, but Israel is not being active at this time. So Jonathan's seeing, he could see the enemy and all the evil that they're doing to the land right in front of him, and he turns around and sees Israel biting their nails, and Saul sitting under some pomegranate fig tree in Gibeah. And we find ourselves a lot of time in this same position where we're supposed to be, we're with the Lord's people. But especially in these end days, the wicked are flaunting themselves right in front of God and everybody, right in front of the children of God. And when you look around, you see many of the Lord's people are scared, they're hiding, and in some cases they're defecting to the other side. So we just have to keep in mind, because we know the end of the story. Like, we know the end of this story, we know the end of the story in our own period of time here. We just have to know that the Lord, He's just bringing the enemy in range. He's just bringing them in range for us. So we cannot let ourselves fret over evildoers, as it says in Proverbs. Don't fret over evildoers. God has a plan, all worked out. We just have to make sure that we're listening to when He says go, we're ready to go. So there's our third glimpse. We found out who and what He is and where He is. Now in our fourth glimpse, we find out how God has uniquely equipped Him. How He has uniquely equipped Him. We're going to verses 19 and verses 22. Now there was no smith found throughout all the land of Israel. That's quite something. For the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make them swords and spears. Okay, that's just ancient form of gun control. That's the exact same concept for the exact same reasons. There's nothing new under the sun. Verse 22. So it came to pass in the day of battle that there was neither sword nor spear. Now they obviously could make, sticks, and they had axes and stuff. But they did not have the best weapons for war. There was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people that were with Saul and Jonathan. That's sad. But with Saul and Jonathan, his son, was there found. So he's one of only 2 warriors in the whole army of Israel that has a sword and spear that is perfectly equipped for the battle of that time period. It's perfectly equipped. That's a unique situation when you're the only one of 2. Jonathan has rare tools in his hands. So whether it's a rod against Egypt, or 1 sword against the Philistines, or 1 vote in an election, whatever you want to put in there, little as much if God is in it. The Lord asks us all, what's in your hand? So there's our fourth glimpse. We see He is uniquely equipped. He is in position with God's people. And He has the fighting skills and the rank to do something. Well, let's see what He does. Let's go on to pass into the chapter 14 and go to verse 1 and 2. And it came to pass on a day that Jonathan the son of Saul said to the young men that bare his armor, Come, let us go over to the Philistines' garrison that is on the other side of the canyon. And Saul tarried at the uttermost part of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree, which is in Migron. And the people that were with him were about 600 men. Okay, we knew he started out with 3,000. That shows you just how many had left him. Okay, so let's compare these two. And Jonathan when the Lord said go, he's utilizing, we find out in this fifth glimpse of him that he is being a good steward. He's showing good stewardship over what the Lord has given him. He's given him positioning, equipping. And the first words we hear out of his mouth in the Bible is, come, let us go. Come, let us go. And he even tells him where it is. We're going to go over to the enemy versus Saul. Saul is a warrior, even greater. He's the king. Saul is positioned in the same place. Saul is just as uniquely equipped, but Saul is tarrying now. He's pausing. He's under a tree somewhere in the shade. There's a big difference between tarrying under a tree and saying, come, let us go. There's a big difference. Which one's behaving as a king? That's always kind of my thought when I read that. Let's continue to verse 14, the end of verse 3 there. Talks about the priesthood that's with him. And the people knew not that Jonathan was gone. Well, it just said up above here, and he told not his father. So he didn't tell anyone else and of the people, nor did he tell his family. He was secure. When you're truly following the Spirit of the Lord, you really don't have to ask anyone else's counsel whether or not you should obey. When the Lord says go, you go. As his father finds out, obedience is better than sacrifice. You don't have to have a great counsel to know whether you should go in the Lord's, use the Lord's directives. And so, we come to our second character quality. This entire feat we know that he's fixing to embark on comes under the heading of faith. He's showing great faith. It's a work of faith. But write this particular one down. We can parse it just a little bit more specifically. He's showing faith and confidence in God's leading. God's telling me to do this. Where I'm going. Come, let us go. Let's go to verse 4 and 5. In between the passages by which Jonathan sought to go over unto the Philistines' garrison, there was a sharp rock on the one side and a sharp rock on the other. And the name of the one was Bozez, and the name of the other was Sinah. The forefront of the one was situated northward over against Michmash, and the other southward over against Gibeah. Well, that's a break in the narrative, isn't it? That's quite a break. You're going along here, talking about the battles and what everybody's doing, and all of a sudden we have geography that we thought has already been established. Philistia is in Michmash, and Israel is in Gibeah. Why do we need information about the topography here? The Lord thought it necessary to give us more information about the topography here between these two camps. Well, let's look a little deeper and see what we find. And between the passages by which Jonathan sought to go over, there was a pass. There was an easy way. You can Google it. That pass is still there 3,000 years later. There is a pass. Jonathan sought to go between them. He's essentially wanting to do it the hard way. He's doing it the hard way. Well, here's the hard way. These two verses describe this gorge or canyon. It runs east and west, east-west. It runs east and west, and it's now called the Wadi Sunemwit, Suwenit, meaning Canyon of the Little Thorn Tree. So we know that on the south side of this canyon is the town of Gibeah. And Gibeah means hill or hillside. And there's also a form of that word which also relates to a place of illicit worship. When, there's a lot of kings being mentioned in Chronicles and stuff, they tore down not the high hills. Place of illicit worship. This was also Saul's home, which he made his capital, and that was where the Israelites were camping. Well, on the side of the canyon that was on the side of Gibeah, on that south side, that rock face of that gorge was called Sinah. It means to prick. It's sharp, thorny. There's a lot of different forms, debate about the specific, but the general meaning is clear. Prick, thorny, sharp. Also a form of slippery, as in treacherous. It's described as having thorn bushes all along it. It's cold, dark, and ruddy. And it's on the south side, so it is always in the shadows. It's never in the sun. Okay, so the north side it's describing, on the north side of this canyon is the town of Michmash, now called Mukhmas, and the language has changed it just a little bit. That means hidden treasures of the Most High. Hidden treasures of the Most High. That is where the Philistines were camping. Now this north side of this canyon, this north side rock face, that is called Bozez. That's the side that's called Bozez, meaning shining or gleaming. And the reason for that is because the rock that is cropping out of the soil there is a very, very white strata. And so, since it's on the north, it is always in the sunlight, and this white strata is always gleaming in the sunlight, reflecting it. So this is the way, scaling two cliffs, that Jonathan sought to get to the Philistines' garrison. You have to remember there was an easy way, but the catch is exactly where the Philistines were camped. The easy way is guarded by the enemy. Well, that's a lot of interesting information, I suppose, if we get into that sort of thing. But why is this relevant to the story here? Is it just show that it was really, really hard? Well, in a way. But the cliffs, I believe, are an analogy for Jonathan's life and obviously have applications to all believers. That Jonathan, historically, is overshadowed dramatically by the greater, if you want to use that term, the greater men in his life, such as Saul and David, viewed greater because they're kings. But as you read about him, you find that he did not live in the shadows of other men. He did not let these two men or these two obstacles determine whether or not he was going to accomplish God's will. So look at it this way. Seneh and Moses were both jagged rock cliffs. David and Saul were both imperfect mortal men. They were kings, tested by the trials of office. But the two things differentiated Saul and David, main things. Their juxtaposition to the sun, the light of God, and what they allowed to grow on the cliff faces of their hearts. Seneh is the first cliff that Jonathan had to traverse. That's the one he had to go down, low in that canyon. This represents Saul. We know Saul did not keep the cliff face of his heart clean. He let the thorns of envy, jealousy, suspicion to breed all through his heart, letting those thorn bushes grow up and tear anyone who came near him with those thorns of his heart, and sometimes even chaplains. He would rip anybody who came near him. And also that slippery mire of public opinion and fear. That hill of illicit worship, was he not forbidden? Illicit means forbidden. Forbidden to offer the sacrifice or to keep anything alive. These thorns that he allowed to grow in his life choked out the light of God in him. And he lived in the shadows, just as his cliff face did, viewing his friends as enemies, those that would have loved and served him most faithfully. The next cliff that Jonathan would have had to traverse is Moses. He had to climb up to the other side to get to the enemy. Moses is representative of David. We know David did keep his heart clean. He's called a man after God's own heart. He was able to reflect God's heart. This north side is perpetually in the sun, like glistening back, not shining on its own like David, who's just a mortal man, but reflecting back to the sun its own brilliance. So Jonathan had to overcome not one but two cliffs. He had to overcome not one but two great men, one bad, one good, to accomplish Jonathan's purpose of getting to the enemy. So that's a beautiful picture of his resolve, character trait of resolution to God's purpose. So he has his sights set on the enemies of God's people, right over there. He left Gibeah, left the tainted, to get to Michmash and find out what Jehovah had hidden for him. He didn't take the easy route because we know the devil's always lying in wait at that broad, wide way that leads to destruction. Once he got down there, he couldn't stay in the valley because we all have a high calling. Saul's always bring you down to the valley and leave you there and ditch you down in the valley. And he couldn't allow this closed door, this hard rock face, this closed door that David represented in his life. David was nothing but a closed door to Jonathan. I mean, in an actual, literal sense. He was nothing but a closed door. He couldn't let that make him bitter towards God, hateful to his father, who actually messed it up for him, or envious toward David. That would have been slipping onto that easy pathway again. That would have been trying to get on that easy path, that carnal human route. But God used that closed door that David represented, that hard, shining cliff face, to help lift Jonathan up, to lift him to his purpose. And once he arrived on the other side, we know what he did. He accomplished his mission. He made war with the enemy. And we know the promised land in our study of the festivals. What's the promised land? Territory held by the enemy. And victorious victories over them. So, once he got there, he accomplished his mission. So just like when he scaled these cliffs that required a tremendous amount of natural strength, so during his trials with Saul and Jonathan required a tremendous amount of strength of character and integrity to deal with it in a way that God would be pleased with. So, moving on to verse 6. Verse 6.